Welcome to this book launch of book of short stories titled Shabine by Hazel Simmons-McDonald. The University of the West Indies Press welcomes you to the launch of Shabine and Other Stories by Hazel Simmons-McDonald, published by the University of the West Indies Press. Hazel Simmons is with us, and we have two other guests with us, Antonia MacDonald and Esther Phillips. Just a quick word about our participants. Esther Phillips is an award-winning poet and author of a number of books, including several collections with the People Tree Press based in the UK. In 2018, Esther was appointed Barbados Poet Laureate. It's a pleasure to have Esther Phillips with us today. Antonia MacDonald is St Lucian, is of course Barbadian. Antonia MacDonald was born and grew up in St Lucia. She now lives in Grenada, where she is professor in the School of Arts and Science and associate dean in the School of Graduate Studies, St George's University. She writes on contemporary Caribbean women writers, St Lucian literature, and Eastern Caribbean popular culture. Her work has appeared in many journals, Caribbean and international journals. She is the author of Making Homes in the West Indies, and she edited the collection, The Fiction of God Sent Toma, a case book in 2018 for People Tree Press. Professor MacDonald sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of West Indian Literature and the CSA Journal, and is the book review editor of the Journal of West Indian Literature. And now to the guest of the moment, Professor Hazel Simmons-McDonald is St Lucian. She has lived and worked in Barbados for over 30 years. She's Professor Emerita of Applied Linguistics at the UWI and has published textbooks on language learning, as well as several articles on educational issues in Creole and Creole-influenced vernacular contexts. Although in retirement, she continues to do research in this field. She also devotes time to creative writing, and we are here with her today to discuss her creative writing. Just a quick word on Hazel's creative writing. She has published poems in journals, including the Malahat Review, the Literary Review, the Atlanta Review, and others. She has won a prize in the Frank Collymore Literary Endowment for a short collection of fiction in 2018. Her collection, Shabine and Other Stories, which is being officially launched now, was published, as I told you earlier, by the UWI Press in December 2021. I want to welcome Hazel Simmons-McDonald at this time, and we'll chat with Hazel a bit about her work and her background, academic and educational background. And after that, we'll bring in our participants with us. Hazel Simmons-McDonald, a pleasure to be chatting with you today. Congratulations on Shabine, which I have right here next to me. Congratulations, Hazel, on just a little chat for a while, Hazel. Welcome once again on behalf of the UWI Press. But a little chat for a while, Hazel, about your educational background. We read in your bio, your work in linguistics, you're Professor Emerita of UWI. Interesting enough, your bio didn't mention your tremendous work with starting the open campus of UWI. But tell us a little bit about your sort of educational background, your interest in linguistics and language a bit before we get into the literature part of your work.
Oh, thanks a lot for the welcome, Robert. I appreciate your being here to lead us through this. Well, we knew each other at school. I mean, you know, secondary school, we didn't have science at the convent, and we used to have to hop over to the college for science classes if we wanted them. So I didn't have the opportunity to do science, but I always thought I could be a doctor until I discovered that I was scared to death of blood when I saw it.
Yes.
So that put that to bed for me. And I think I did okay with my English classes. At least the nun who taught us that told me that my descriptions were fine. And I owe a lot, I think, to Mrs. Patricia Charles, who really brought literature alive for the whole class. We all flourished under her tutelage. So
did I also, yes.
Yes, of course. And she mentored us right through after school, because I was in the drama group, creative and performing arts. I was a member.
So
of
was
that.
I, yes.
So, yes, and I acted in Raisin in the Sun as
Indeed.
Ruth, which she directed. So yes, from then I had an interest in the arts. And when I taught at the A-level college, you helped me with production that we put for the sixth formers there.
Wow, I didn't remember that, but
With,
yes.
yes, with
Okay.
Kamal Brathwaite's poetry. It was a whole
Yes.
dramatic recitation performance.
Mm-hmm.
So that interest carried right through to my teaching of literature,
Mm-hmm.
both at the Teachers College, because at the Teachers College I directed a play. You helped me also with that, and we put it on at the
I didn't remember all that. Yes.
at the center, the center that the church has down there on
Yes.
Newton Street.
Paris Center. Paris Center.
Paris
Yes.
Center. So we had that play there, and we also had that performance of the students at sixth form at the school at one of the
Yes.
prize giving sessions. And we had a lot of fun with it, I'd say. It really was an animated session. We went down between the pitons of all places for rehearsal. And we
Yes.
had
Yes.
dance and drama and poetry and recitation. So it was a good experience for all of us. And so I tried to keep involved while I was teaching, doing that.
Now, I suspect most of our viewers do not know this about you, which I'm about to reveal. This year, the St Lucia government awarded you probably the second highest honor in national awards. You received the St Lucia Cross for your work at UWE in linguistics and other things, a recognition, Hazel, of your tremendous work you've done in education and in linguistics development, especially working with the Creole language. But there's something else I'd like to let our viewers know about you, even as we come to talk more directly about your creative writing interest and your creative writing work. In your family background, you come out of, let me try to make the right connection, out of people who were very much part of the golden era of St. Lucian arts and culture. I'm thinking specifically of your uncle, Harold Simmons. Harold Simmons is well known to Walcott scholars as the mentor of Derek Walcott and Dunstan St. Omer, two of the major artists of their time, Nobel laureate and the premier artist of a generation, Dunstan St. Omer. And Derek, in his book, Another Life, has paid tribute to Harold Simmons, your uncle. Harold Simmons was a painter. He was an archaeologist. He was a linguist interested in Creole language. And so in many ways, your roots are very much in the St. Lucian arts and culture, and perhaps even your interest in linguistics. How do you think, Hazel, your connections, not just what you mentioned earlier, your own involvement with the arts and culture of St. Lucia before you left, but how much do you think your family background may have influenced you even as a child growing up, knowing your uncle and the work he was doing, his connection with Dunstan St. Omer and the Walcott brothers, Derek and Roddy, and the painters and musicians like Charles Cadet and Cécile Descartes? How much do you think, Hazel, those influences around which you and I shared and others of our generation shared have really nurtured your creative interests and your creative gifts?
Well, I'll focus on one little bit that my uncle, I'm really forever grateful to him for that.
Right.
Because you know in St. Lucia how we had these situations where some parents thought Creole was a bastardized language, not a language, and some families did not allow their children to speak Creole, which I thought was terrible. But when he was at home a lot, you know, and it was around me all the time, the French Creole. So I was acquiring it as I grew up, as children do. Whatever you speak to them, they will acquire. So me and my sisters and my brothers were acquiring it. And so we could understand what the adults were saying. So they couldn't slip into Creole to thinking that we would not understand. Yes. So when my father would say, okay, don't talk that and stop, my uncle would say, don't tell them that. Let them speak their Creole. And for that, I'm forever grateful to him because it really allowed me to feel free speaking and learning more Creole, because that became my mission as I went into higher study. I had thought I should probably do literature, but then I shifted into linguistics precisely because of this language situation in St. Lucia. There were so many children leaving school without learning how to read English, and nothing was being done about their own Creole. So it's what Dennis Craig describes as subtractive bilingualism, that we had so many children not being at all literate in their own language because it wasn't nurtured, and not having, because of their dominance with Creole, not getting the second language approaches to learn English and to become literate in it. So I thought that maybe I should do something in that area, and that's what motivated it. So I'm forever grateful that I'm a bilingual in Creole and English. And of course, I learned French in school and some Spanish later, but
Yes.
I think I owe that to my uncle for really bringing the importance of allowing us to speak our Creole and English. He's the one who emphasized that a lot when I was.
And I'm sure his artistic interest must have influenced you too. But two
Yeah.
quick words before we bring in our guests with us today, Antonia and Esther Phillips. Who were some of the Caribbean people in terms of linguistics who influenced you? But tie that to another question. So we segue into Shabine. Who were some of the, if you want, Caribbean writers who also nurtured? You see, in a sense, we're looking at your linguistics background, also your literature background, and there is a tie-in. But who are some of the people in Caribbean linguistics who really influenced you, like Mr. Dr. Alsop, and also in Caribbean literature? Who are some of the writers who, in a sense, have brought us to where we are today talking about your book?
Okay, for the linguistics part, I would say Lawrence Carrington.
Lawrence Carrington.
He was phenomenal. He came down as a graduate student to study Creole, and he worked with my uncle.
Yeah,
and through Mrs. Patricia Charles, at school, I must have been third or fourth form at the time, we got to know about him and about the work he was doing. And so that really, really got me interested in the Creole, because I'm saying, well, here's somebody coming to write the grammar of the Creole.
Right.
And so that was fascinating. So I say he was very influential, and even up to doing my dissertation, he was one of the examiners of my dissertation. And so I owe a lot to him, to his work, because, you know, reading what he has written about not just St. Lucian Creole, but Creoles in general, really opened up a whole world for me about what are called the indigenous languages that can be stigmatized simply because we don't understand. So I would say definitely Lawrence Carrington, and later John Rickford, Professor John Rickford at Stanford.
Lovely.
And at Mona, when I went up, there was Professor Jean DaCosta and Mrs. Joan McLaughlin. Professor Jean DaCosta taught us. It was a very small class because we went into English honors. And it is through her that I began to, I wasn't the best student, I have to tell you, because it seemed to me a tedious thing to sit there and, you know, learn about all these language forms and schwa and all these phonological. But it's such a fascinating thing. She made it interesting, Dr. DaCosta and Mrs. McLaughlin. And I would say for the literature part, because we had to do literature courses, Professor Eddie Bowe. Professor Eddie Bowe's work. He was inspirational. He never judged, he encouraged us a lot. So I would say these are the people: Professor Bowe for literature, certainly, and Professor DaCosta, Professor Joan McLaughlin, Professor Rickford, and Lawrence Carrington for linguistics.
Wonderful. So UE has played, in fact, a great part in your professional work as a linguist and linguistics professor, but also in your whole creative writing and endeavors, I would say.
Yes.
And here we are, UE Press launching your book, Shabine.
From the point of view of studying the literature.
Yes.
And getting an introduction to linguistics. You know. We did Old English, we did Middle English, we went through the whole historical development of English with Mrs. McLaughlin and Dr. DaCosta, Professor DaCosta now. So we had a firm grounding in that. And then when I finished that, I thought, okay, I'm going home to teach children who speak Creole.
Right.
So I came home for a year, then went back and did a year. And Cecil Gray was the teacher. Pretty good.
Yes, I've met him some years ago. Yes,
helping us to open up, you know, how to present literature to children for enjoyment. And you know, he's written several books for children, and so. So I think I had the very best through my experience at Mona, from my tutors.
Wonderful.
And then
wonderful.
Stanford, yes.
Okay, let's bring in our friends Antonia McDonald and Esther Phillips. And we're going to concentrate on your new book of short stories called Shabine. And I've been reading it myself. And all I'll say about it right now, because I want to hear the discussion and the conversations from Esther and Antonia, and throw in my little 2 pence as I can. But I found it, Hazel, my description of it now It's a a book of Creole magical realism. I see on the back that term was also used, the magical realism out of Latin America. But what you've done is seem to, in many of the stories, is created Creole magical realism. But let me leave that hanging for a while and welcome to our screens Esther Phillips, Poet Laureate of Barbados, and Antonia MacDonald of St. George's University, Grenada, a fellow St. Lucian. And let's say what they think about Shabine. They also have been reading Shabine. Antonia, welcome, and Esther Phillips, welcome. Join us as we talk a bit more specifically about Hazel's new book, Shabine. Esther, would you come in and tell us what you thought? Hi, Antonia, I see you. Come on, Esther. Let's have Esther on with us. And we'll hear from Esther first. We'll give Esther the first round. Esther, what did you think of Shabine, Hazel's book? Of course, just before I go there, I must remind people, Hazel has published a book of poetry, Silk, Cotton, and Other Trees, with Ian Randall. Some years ago, Ian Randall Publishers. So this is a second creative work, as it were. But Esther, what did you think of Shabine, this book of short stories by Hazel Simmons?
Well, first, my heartiest congratulations to you, Hazel, on the publication and now the launch of Shabine and Other Stories. I'm certainly honored to call you friend and proud to have you as a highly valued member of Writers Inc. And now to the collection itself. A major feature that stands out for me is the multi-layered texture of the work. Nothing is what it seems on the surface. Indeed, the story Mirror may well be seen as a prototype of the entire collection. The myriad reflections, fractured images, different dimensions and perspectives, depending on how you look, clashing against one another, and the changing effects of light and darkness. I find it also significant that the nevus around Madeleine's left eye is compared with a harlequin's mask. This image brings to mind the harlequin in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. This character is colorfully dressed, light-hearted, and funny on the outside. At the same time, he is mercurial, enigmatic, and closely linked to the themes of deception and betrayal. Similarly, one notes in this collection that the reader is permitted to look behind the beauty of the landscape, the characters' smiles, the pleasant words, inviting innocence and trust, to where there are unexpected shifts in tone and mood, and even the specter of tragic death. Hazel, in my view, continues her questioning of the substance and the imaginary in the story Photo Take 3. This time, we're not looking into a mirror, but through the lens of a camera. Here is the double image, so to speak, of Anna, the fully clothed and cloistered nun, and the naked, vulnerable 10-year-old. Mr. Elias, rightly named, does not see the artistic beauty of line and shape in the child model, but an opportunity to exploit. That the story is set in the convent itself is telling, and again brings together several of the tensions that Hazel is working through so skillfully in this collection. For me, nature sings in these stories. There's the richness of the rose's color and perfume, the brilliant yellow of petals from the pui tree, the bright blooms in the convent garden. But here again, Hazel uses nature as a backdrop or frame for the movement of the plot, as well as the development of her characters. For example, Rosa's growth in consciousness, that's in the flowering of Rosa, is somehow made parallel with the growth of the roses. And the showering of pui flowers is a gift of comfort and peace to the beach. But it is the sea that creates the most powerful and lasting impression. On the one hand, the sea provides pleasure and comfort. Mav swims, relaxation. Imogene, in her reflective mode, gazes out to the sea. Moise, the fisherman, has a close bond with the sea, and Lionel loves his deep sea diving. But like the mirror, the sea has a quote unquote darkened space in the center that beckons to those who struggle against its force or who enter willingly when life has become unbearable. Hazel Simmons-McDonald's stories are beautifully crafted. With a linguistic ease, she moves between standard English and Creole, thereby delineating class differences, but also adding authentic local color to her characters. Several of her stories end on a high point of dramatic tension, but with enough carefully interwoven hints in the story, so the reader is not left guessing about the tragic outcome. But particularly in Bolams, we see what one may call the author's work of grace, when the Bolams save a mother's life, and in so doing, they themselves find freedom and light. By extension, redemption is made possible for the characters Madeline and Imogene. Shabine and Other Stories is a valuable addition to the ever-increasing store of Caribbean literature. The writer presents us with universal themes: love, betrayal, family relationships with their complexities, race and class conflicts. Her portrayal of characters is lifelike, and her use of dialogue, while seeming natural to the speakers, serves other important functions of plot and thematic development. Significantly, there's the church with its adherents and the ongoing struggles with sin, corruption, and faithful obedience to the rules and rituals set out. Morella's husband and his inability to come to terms with his sexuality and religious devotion is one such example. Overall, the stories are very Caribbean. We understand the plight of the Shabine and her being cast as an outsider by the rest of the community. We're familiar with the superstitions: the broom turned upside down, the man you must, and leave me never, potions, and dear departed. The practice of migration in seeking for better opportunities, and certainly the lush landscape that is an ever-present backdrop. Shabine and Other Stories is indeed a tapestry that in the hand Shabine and Other Stories is indeed a tapestry that in the hands of its author, Hazel Simmons-McDonald, is interwoven with literary skill, insights into human strengths and frailties, the struggle between the material and the spiritual, all set against the vibrant light and color that is found only in this tropical region of the globe. I have no doubt at all that this collection will find its way into the hands of many at home and abroad, and that lives will be made richer for its reading.
Thank you very much, Esther Phillips, Poet Laureate of Barbados. Let Antonia come on, and let's hear some response from Antonia McDonald, Professor McDonald, and her own response to the work itself. And Hazel, by all means, join us so we can have an interactive and together discussion about your work as we discuss with both Esther and Antonia. Antonia, all yours. Let's hear what you thought yourself.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Congratulations to Hazel. Like Esther, I am thrilled by this publication. I think it's a work that has been long in the making. What I particularly like about it, and a lot of what Esther has said, I concur with. What I like is the way Hazel has captured the texture of St. Lucian quotidian life at a really particular point in its social history. So this is a nice sociocultural text that we can go back to because, you know, the modern reader has the virtue, the benefit of Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter. But here, what we have is a snapshot and a written script that is going to allow us into that world, a world that we no longer always have access to. I like the fact that the stories are told from so many different perspectives, from young, from old, from fantastical, from dead. I also enjoy the fact, like in a lot of Caribbean literature, the protagonists are mostly women and children. So I feel that is good. What I was also enjoying was the fact that the narrator, who is an omniscient narrator, often seems very familiar and sometimes is giving us a wink, making us think all is not what it seems to be. And that plays back into what Esther talked about the fracturing of images, the mirror, and how it becomes prismatic. So in the interest of time, if I was supposed to focus on something, and I want to footnote what I'm going to say now with a small postscript, as some of you may know that Professor Emerita Hazel Simmons-McDonald, so as we are now referring to her, I know as Miss Simmons, because she was my A-level teacher. And so when I sit here now talking to you as St Lucian reader, the literary critic that I am, I owe to her, because these skills in critical appreciation were the skills that she taught me at A-level. So if sometimes I refer to her as Hazel, rather than talking about her by referring to her with her surname, which is what the formality of this conversation might require, you will indulge me. So when Esther was talking about the dramatic tension on which the story ends, I thought, yes, a lot of them leave us with this, so what happens next question? And I will want to say that this question is, look out for Hazel's next published creative work. Okay. I also agree with Esther about the smoothness with which Hazel negotiates Creole and English, St. Lucian English Creole. And I appreciate the fact that she, in making that Creole accessible through her use of supporting contextual phrases, does not give us a glossary. So, but that in the absence of these moorings, she always puts them side by side. She gives us the supporting phrases so as to help situate us in the context of the story. And I thought that the title story, Shabine, was really nicely done, where she puts the ditty in Creole and alongside it, she puts the St. Lucian translation. So yes, I agree. And I'm glad that Esther, as a Barbadian, made that point, because I thought that is where this point is made really apparent, that it allows all kinds of readers in. And when Esther was talking about Delhi photo take 3, I thought, yes, this is a fascinating story, but I wanted to zero in here now on the St. Lucian penchant for wordplay, because there is a deliberateness to the choice of the name Zodi. And it, in fact, it is mentioned in the story because Zodi is a Creole name for garbage. And I thought, yes, because it speaks to the moral decrepitude of a photographer who not only lures young, defenseless girls into posing nude for him, but 15 years later, he attempts to continue wreaking his particular brand of cruelty on one of the models, the young novitiate, Anna, that he had previously abused. Now, Hazel leaves his fate after he's hit his head on the wet chapel floor. His fate remains unknown to us. But I thought, interestingly enough, the image of Anna running virtually naked into the sunlit garden leads the reader to hope that she is finally freed from the trauma of her past. And like Esther, I agree that there's no coincidence in the antagonist being named Alias, for he represents the many molesters who not only come as wolves dressed in lamb's clothing, but who manage to escape detection and accordingly escape punishment. But when I was reading that story, Robert, I thought this issue of unpunished child molestation is an issue that is repeated with a lot of delicacy in the last story, Tapestry. But at this time, the offender is a priest, Père Auguste. And it's going to bring me to talk another way about what Esther has talked about, the role of the church in this book. But when we meet Père Auguste, he's asking his young female confessors inappropriate questions about their genitalia while he masturbates in the confessional box. But this tale of horror is counterpointed by the protagonist, Felice, aka Nancy, recalling the hard slap that Mother Superior gives her as she sits in the church, traumatized by what she has witnessed. And I thought to myself, yes, the psychic violence of this sexual harassment is being made graphic by Mother Superior physical violence. And I thought, yes, also that Père Auguste's violating hand, which he has used not only to touch himself inappropriately, a hand he has also used to touch Felice, is now replaced by another abusive hand, and that both hands belong to persons in position of power. But what happens is that the powerlessness now find refuge in silence, one, in using artist therapy, two, or in using humor as a defense. Because at the end of that story, we are told about Martha talking about Father Père Auguste that she recognizes in the tapestry. And she says the schoolgirls used to call him Père Perv and laugh at the inappropriate things he said to them. And yes, this avowal is one of the ways of handling sexual abuse. So in this story, I felt when I was reading it, because it really resonated with me, this last story, that Felice's multi-layered tapestry is emblematic of the multiple, and Esther herself picked up on it, the multiple discursive positions that Hazel, Professor Simmons-McDonald, assumes in her handling of an issue, which is now circulating in contemporary discussion, an issue which in St. Lucian society, I think we have for too long been silent. And I was hoping that perhaps these stories will allow readers, victims, to find courage to step out, to speak out against these types of abuse. And what was interesting also to me was that in her evocation of St. Lucia's social history, she was foregrounding always the deep influence of the Catholic Church on St. Lucian society. Because even when the church is not referenced directly, Robert, it is shaping the ambitions, the power, the locations of power, the fact that the hypocrisy, the rigidity, the sense, the narrowness of the worldview, the class prejudices, the double standards, even the colorism. And so when Esther was mentioning Theodore in the story Virgo, I was thinking also that it's interesting because part of what has happened to him, the fact that he has not come to his own fullness, is because his own illegitimacy has prevented him from entering into the priesthood, which is his heart's desire. And it is that thwarted dream that leads Theodore into trapping himself and his wife in a sexless marriage. I was also thinking that the influence of the church, Esther, is seen in the hypocrisy of those who outwardly perform devoutness, but who in private seem to be leading very immoral lives. And I thought that Hilaire Chalmine that we meet in Tom Pages seems hairy, we meet him. He seems to be the epitome of respectability. Right? He disregards his marital vows and he disregards the children that ensue from these infidelities. So here you have the family devotedness, which is advocated by the church, which he's performing, which is emblematized in his scrupulous record keeping as father and husband. But that record keeping does not truly extend to his illegitimate children, and their erasure from his life, the torn pages in his journal, still does not give him the absolution that he is seeking, Esther. And it is as if in his life and in his death, these illegitimate children remain as absent present. Their stories are never fully told. So these are the kinds of, when I was reading it, I thought, here are the issues, Robert, that are consolated. But I am getting excited and I'm speaking too much.
Hey.
I'm going to talk.
All right, thanks a lot. Good. So thanks to both Esther and Antonio for the content analysis. And as you said, Antonio, you and I have grown up with Hazel, we know Hazel for years, so people will forgive us if we don't keep calling her Professor Emerita Simmons-McDonald because she's an old friend. But certainly like you, Antonia, I picked out a lot of stories seem to be set in a St Lucia particular period. But for me, technically, what intrigued me technically, and I've called this earlier on Creole magical realism. I think of Anthony Joseph's The Frequency of Magic came out a couple of years ago, and Marcia Douglas from Jamaica, Marvelous Equations of the Dread, where more and more Caribbean writers are exploring technically the whole area of magical realism. And I think what Hazel has done there is very interesting. Her characters move easily between the dimensions of flesh and spirit, this world and the spiritual realm. But now let's hear from Hazel Simmons-McDonald herself. Hazel, how about giving us some readings from Shabine and other stories? Let's do that now, so our audience can hear actually from the book itself, which we've been talking about.
Thanks, Robert, Antonia, and Esther. And it's quite okay to call me Hazel. I don't know why you don't making an issue.
I know.
That's how you know me anyway.
Antonia put us on the spot.
But that's quite fine. I think she's going back to her years in sixth form.
Indeed.
Moved from that so long ago, and we call each other by our first name.
But we're here as friends together also.
It's Hazel.
So do give us some readings now, Hazel, from Shabine and other stories published by the UE Press.
Okay, so I will just read on the big part of the beginning of Shabine, just the first page, the first section that sets the tone of the story. So I read that first, Shabine. And I also, before I go on, I'll read the last part of the story. So the first and the last part, okay? Okay? Shabine, look me here, you see me? You stand up over there watching me. You think I don't see you. Look me here. I'm going to stand up under the light for you to see me good. Come from the shadow. You want to see me? Well, come see me. Justine rose slowly from the old soapbox on which she sat. Beneath the full-fledged skirt of the red dress she wore most nights, and which now cascaded from her hips, he could see the outline of firm buttocks, the slender shapeliness of her thighs. His heart beat faster, as much from excitement as from fear, as to what she would do now that she had discovered him. They said she had a vicious temper. They said that her red hair, which hung to her shoulders in a thick woolly tangle, was testimony of that. They said she could do nothing about it, even if she tried. Once, he had seen her burst through her front door spitting profanities as she threw stones at the boys who had stood facing her house on the other side of the street, taunting her with the chant they had composed about her. They sang it first in Creole, the local lingo, and then in English. L'or et d'argent sa mwen ni, chouy ek diamant sa pa mwen pa ni. Ouwe mwen, vini bo mwen, do jamais. I have gold, I have silver, copper and diamonds I don't have. You see me, come kiss me, darling whore. And they would press their palms to their mouths and make an exaggerated kissing sound. So that's the first part I'm going to read. And then I will read the last part of the story. Now, a grown man in his mid-30s, returning to arrange his grandmother's funeral, he stood watching her beneath the lamp. He wondered whether she too smelled the fragrance of paradise plums. She turned to face him directly where he stood in the shadow. You see me? She asked softly. You see me? Maybe you want to come kiss me too? Maybe? She stared hard and long at him, while his heart raced and the sound thundered so loudly in his ears, he thought she must hear it. Then she turned, glanced at him over her shoulder, swept the mass of curls from her forehead, and with a toss of her head, walked back through the gate into the room in the yard and shut the door. He thought that if things had been different, if there wasn't that stretch of wall between his house and hers, if in those early days they could somehow have claimed the afternoons by the river, savoring paradise plums together, that perhaps, just perhaps, there might have been plenty of copper. So that's the beginning and ending of Shabine. I'll read one from Boloms. Now, Boloms, as you all know, probably Robert and Antonia, we refer to unborn, aborted children, fetuses, as Boloms. And
would there be duppies in either? Would there be duppies in either Bajan or Jamaican lingo?
yeah, well, they would be both. I don't know if there's a special word for Boloms. You remember the Boloms?
The unborn child.
Walcott has it, yes, in his play. And the
Tijon,
Bolom is redeemed in Tijon,
right?
Because he does a good act for the mother. And
an aborted fetus, kind of, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And I was amazed to find when I went to the French, the research center, the folk research center, that there was a whole article on it, and that burnt up, but fortunately I had copied it so I can give it back. I learned in that the Chinese also refer to Boloms in a particular way, giving them characteristics that we don't give to ours.
Okay.
So it seems to be something that runs in folk traditions, not just...
Yes, possibly, yes.
Yeah, so
correct.
Anyway, but I thought we should do something about it because always Boloms seem to be so hard done by. So,
yeah.
I also misuse, so thought badly of. So I wrote Boloms.
It was one of those queer magical realism stories also.
Yes.
It might come out from your reading here. Yeah.
Well, I'm only going to read a section, a very short section, their imagined lives. So they've been coming out in the night because they cannot come out in sunlight, and they watch this Bolom's mother on the beach. And so they sit there, but they have to go back into some cave when the sun's coming up.
From the light, yes.
And that's where they're imagining the lives they would have had if they were not Boloms.
Yes.
They imagine lives. He perched on a smooth rock, his back hunched, and his head pulled into his shoulders. She was curled on her side in fetal position on an adjacent rock. She looked around. There aren't any bats. I like that. She sat up, turned to look at him. What do you do down here all day? What is there to do? You know what this life is like. We can't survive in sunlight. He paused for a moment, sighed, and said, I think about the things I see when I roam at night. I imagine what she must be doing, what she would be doing if I were part of her life. Mostly, I imagine what my life would have been like if I'd been born. I do that too a lot. What's your life like? He leaned his back against the rock. Family. I imagine my family. My father, mother, and me living together in our house by the sea. We would do things together. They would take me places. I would be at the center of their lives and we would be happy. What else? What do you mean? Well, what about later on when you grow up? I almost always think about when I'm young. I don't know much else to think about. But since I saw that play, I've been thinking how cool it must be to use language like that man who wrote the play. I went back mostly to listen to the language. So perhaps if I'd got older, I'd probably want to use language like that, be a writer or something. Ooh, that's funny. Because since I saw the play, I think I would be an actress. You'd have a hard time with that lisp. Seth who? If I was born, my soul wouldn't be trapped in this puny body, and my head wouldn't be misshapen. I'd be whole and grow, and I wouldn't have a lip. You know what? I'd be an actress and a dancer. My mother was a dancer, and she would teach me and other little girls to dance. Oh, sorry I said that. Okay. I imagine my mother strong. She didn't care much about what people thought or said about her. She would have me as the center of her life, and we would be happy together. I wouldn't care that I didn't know who my father was, because my mother would be everything, and she would never let me feel deprived. She was proud and ignored the local gossip, but someone broke her heart. Know what? She was a fantastic dancer. That's how I got to be a dancer. And I would be an actress too. I would get a part in the play, the part of the Bolom. I would move and speak so the audience would be mesmerized when I said lines like, he shrieked with delight when a mother strangled me before the word light. I would have known life, rain on my skin, sunlight on my forehead. He turned away from her. So you remember the words of the Bolam too. All we both seem to know about our lives is bound up in a play we saw, an imagined life made up by a man. We are nothing. We live in limbo between darkness and the edge of light. We can never be anything with our souls trapped in these clods of flesh, half-formed bodies. Your mother walked into the sea and it swallowed her. Mine sits gazing at the sea like a broken soul. If only it were true that we would be free if we could cross the edge of light. That's
wonderful. Thank you, Hazel. Thank you. Professor Antonia and Esther, I'll ask you to come in for some closing remarks in response to Hazel's reading. But Professor Antonia, you're a literature teacher. What's the term we use in literary criticism when one work of literature responds to another? There's a term for it, right? What she's doing, responding with her story to Derek's play.
Yes.
What do you call that in literature?
They call it intertextuality.
That's right. That's the term. Thank you so much, Professor.
But I want to say,
Right.
Robert, so that there is this deliberate intertextuality with Tija and his brothers.
Yes.
And her, so she's speaking back to that story. She's giving the Bolams life, giving voice to the voiceless. But there's another thing that's going on because one Bolam is Imogene's dead baby, and we met Imogene walking into the sea, and the other Bolam is the aborted fetus from Madeline that we met in the mirror, in the story Mirror. So I thought it was interesting what Hazel is also working with the short story cycle where the stories are connected.
Exactly.
What I also liked about that story is the fact that they wanted to be artists, creatives. Both Bolams aspired to be that. And I thought it was significant because art liberates the imagination. It allows us to hope. That however, whatever the stringencies of one's reality, hope is a constant. It's flickering sometimes. The artist in society seems always in danger of becoming disembodied, of becoming disconnected. But I thought at the end of the story, the selflessness with which the Bolams rescue Madeline, although she's not with as such, reminds us that in the struggle to become, we are ennobled. And that it is courage that makes us anew. And it is courage that transforms us. That was at the heart of Tija and his brothers, just as it is core to Hazel's story. But the intertextuality here, although it's deliberate, I also saw Hazel speaking back unwittingly to Gav Santoma. I don't know if you noticed that, but in her evocation of the CDC, one way, she reminded me of J. Blackbam and the Masqueraders and of Nor Any Country. And I thought in the same way that these two texts tell one story, the story of Peter and Paul Breville, there is she also playing with form, which by the way, as Esther has said, Esther, I agree with you. I think it is in narrative techniques, in her use of form and of structure, that this work is outstanding.
Indeed, I agree with you. And there's interweaving within the stories, technical stuff going on, and the themes, as you pointed out. Esther, give us some final words on what you've heard from Hazel's reading.
And I agree so much with Antonia's insights into this, the way how the network continues in the story. I also want to add that perhaps in a way, I mean, the church doesn't show up too well in these stories at all. But there's a way in which we see, as I said, the work of grace and redemption, because these two fetuses are really the children of Imogene and Madeline, from what I can see. And by extension, that is a case of redemption for them, a work of grace when something good comes out of it. And in a way, these are the very values, if you like, taught by the church, so that in a way, the image of the church is rescued through this work of grace.
Robert, I also want to say though that in tapestry, that recuperation also happens because balanced against the image of an image, literally, the two priests are positioned side by side, and Father Benedict is a good priest.
Right.
Okay, so there is always, and I thought that was part of the skill there, is that it's not presented in absolutes, that characters are redeemed. The possibility,
Agreed.
as it says, for redemption remains always open. So I like that about it.
In fact, I found, Antonia, the portrayal of some of the men, yeah, there's this pair Ogies, but I found the portrayal of the men were very compassionate, understanding. There's this man in a quite unplanned way, I forget the name of the story, where he has two children. Remember, he's going out of a storm, he's sheltering, and the girl is probably afraid of the lightning, and she goes out to meet him, and a child comes out of that.
That is the story, Torn Pages. That's Hilaire.
Yeah, Torn Pages, right, Torn Pages. And it happens again. But what I found about the story, I found the story moving and poignant. It wasn't as though this guy was a kind of bad running around guy, but he found himself in that situation. But that was just one point. But Hazel, any final words before we come to an end of our program today in terms of what has happened today? You're talking about your work, your feelings about your new work, and very much your work is not only a Caribbean work, but in a sense, almost inevitably connects with something Antonio just said. You, in a sense, through this work, fall into the line in a very positive sense of St Lucian writers, where you're making connection between the Walkers and the St Thomas, where you're continuing themes, but developing them further. And for me, the interesting point I keep repeating is the technical things of what you're doing with the magical realism type of format. But do give us some final words, Professor Hazel Simmons-McDonald.
Hazel. Okay,
yeah, just teasing you. Give us some final words before we close off our program.
I have to say that I wrote the stories, but everything they've said, I wouldn't have known a thing about all of that.
Indeed,
stuff.
indeed.
It was just the writing of the story. But I have to say, in connection with that too, that being a part of Writers Inc., of which Esther is the director,
right.
If you bring a story or something there and people give their responses, it really is a nurturing group that really helps you to focus more particularly on your work and the development of your craft. And I don't know, Esther, I joined when we became friends. Well, we were friends for a long time, but then I joined the group for the purpose of writing. And there were very few people, Mark McCourt and a few others. And it's just that because of that I kept writing a story here and there. I have to say, you will have noticed that maybe there's a different tone to each of the stories, because some were written way, way back. When I had time to attend a workshop, I might have written one and so. But since I retired, I wrote the last 4 or 5 stories. You see what I'm saying? So you may have noticed a difference, because if this is a work that was long in the making, as Antonio would have said at the beginning. So I really, I appreciate deeply the opportunities I've had to work with writers like Writers Inc., in Writers Inc., Antonia, who has been my sounding board, because I know that she is a literary person and she's always very frank in her responses. So she does give me some good feedback. So I appreciate very much all of those who have helped to encourage me to finish writing the stories. Let's just put it this way. And I hope that now that I'm retired, I can continue to write. Not poetry, Robert. I wouldn't even have referred to that book, please. But certainly stories. And I'm working on a novel, again in St Lucian tradition, called Masquerade. And I'm just hoping I can write it. So we'll see.
Lovely. All the best with it.
Thank you.
So on behalf of the University of West Indies Press, let me thank Professor Hazel Simmons-McDonald, Emerita, as she's joined us today for the launch of a new book with the press, Shabine. Let me thank Professor Antonia McDonald, who and Poet Laureate Esther Phillips, who have been participants on this program. As we've discussed the new book, Shabine and Other Stories. There's a discount offered by UWI Press from May 25th to June 25th. There's a promotional code you can use, 03SOS22. Use the promotional code at checkout www.uwipress.com or when ordering directly from Longleaf Services, customer service at longleafservices.org or orders at longleafservices.org. While stocks last, does not include shipping and handling charges. All sales final, no returns. So get your copy of Shabine and Other Stories right now, and Esther. So we thank you for today for viewing this program. So on behalf of the University of the West Indies Press from St. Lucia, I'm John Robert Lee. Thank you for joining us.